Long ago, in a distant land surrounded by high mountains and deep forests, there lived a powerful old witch. Her home was at the very peak of a towering mountain, where the cold winds howled, and no one dared to climb. Each year, this witch would leave her lonely mountain and visit the kingdom below. Her destination was always the grand palace of the king, where she demanded a bag of gold. The king, not wanting to anger her, gave her the gold each time without question. One year, a grand celebration filled the palace. The king and queen were rejoicing over the birth of their baby daughter, Princess. Lavish feasts, music and laughter echoed through the halls as nobles and guests from far and wide attended the event. In the middle of this joy, the witch appeared at the palace gates as she did every year and demanded her gold. But this time, the king had a different response. "Tell her to leave," he instructed his servant. "I have spent all the gold on the feast and celebrations. She can return next year for her share." When the witch received this message, her face darkened with rage. She muttered to herself, "He dares to refuse me? He will regret this." Silently, she left the gates, but instead of returning to her mountain, she stayed hidden in the palace gardens, plotting her revenge. That night, as the entire palace slept after the festivities, the witch slipped inside. Using her dark magic, she crept unnoticed into the royal nursery where little Princess lay in her cradle. Without a sound, she picked up the baby and disappeared into the shadows of the night, taking her far away to her mountain lair. The next morning, the king and queen awoke to a nightmare. Their precious daughter was gone. The queen's cries echoed through the halls, and the king immediately summoned his guards and advisors. "Find her!" he commanded. "Search the entire kingdom. Bring back my daughter." Rewards were announced for anyone who could locate the princess. One of the king's wise men said, "The witch who came to the palace last night must have taken her. If we find the witch, we'll find the princess." Search parties were sent to the witch's mountain, but her magic protected her home. As soon as anyone tried to climb, swarms of thick insects appeared, blinding them and forcing them back. After many failed attempts, the king and queen were forced to accept the unthinkable. They would never see their daughter again. They mourned deeply, and the witch never returned to the palace for gold again. Years passed, but the king and queen's sorrow did not fade. They had no other children, and their kingdom was without an heir. One day, one of the king's wise men approached him with an idea. "Your Majesty," he said, "there is an ogre who lives deep in the forest. He owns a magical horse that can climb any mountain. With this horse, someone could reach the witch's lair and perhaps rescue the princess." The king's interest was piqued. "How can we get this horse?" he asked. The wise man hesitated. "That will be difficult," he admitted. "The horse will only allow itself to be ridden by someone who feeds it magic corn. This corn grows in a field of pearls near the ogre's castle. But the field is enchanted. Anyone who tries to gather the corn sinks into the pearls and cannot escape. Only the ogre knows the magic words to safely collect the corn." Despite the challenges, the king announced a bold proclamation. He invited all the princes and noblemen of the land to his palace. "Whoever brings me the magical horse and rescues Princess will marry her and inherit the kingdom," he declared. But the task seemed too dangerous, and one by one, the princes refused. The king then opened the challenge to the poor young men of the kingdom, but they too turned away until a humble peasant stepped forward. "I will try, Your Majesty," the peasant said, "but I will only marry the princess if we both wish it. If she does not love me, I will take only the kingdom as my reward." The king agreed, impressed by the peasant's honesty and courage. The peasant began his journey by seeking help from a fairy who lived in the forest. The fairy listened to his story and said, "To enter the field of pearls, you need the ogre's magic shoes. They are tied to his right foot with a silken thread. You cannot cut or break the thread without waking him, but I will give you this feather. If you tickle his left foot while he sleeps, he will laugh so hard that you can cut the thread unnoticed. Beware of the two-headed dog that guards the ogre. It is beyond my power to stop." The peasant thanked the fairy and set off for the ogre's castle. Late that night he arrived and found the doors unlocked. The ogre, confident in his strength, did not bother locking them. As the peasant entered, the two-headed dog lunged at him, snarling fiercely. Quickly, the peasant threw two large bones he had brought with him, and the dog began gnawing on them, distracted. The peasant crept into the ogre's room and saw the magic shoes tied to the ogre's foot with a delicate thread. Taking the feather, the peasant gently tickled the ogre's left foot. The ogre began to laugh uncontrollably, shaking the bed with his booming laughter. While the ogre was lost in his amusement, the peasant carefully cut the thread and grabbed the shoes. Slipping out of the room, the peasant put on the magic shoes and ran to the field of pearls. The dog, finished with the bones, barked loudly, waking the ogre. Furious, the ogre chased after the peasant. But without his magic shoe, he could not survive the field's enchantment. The pearls swallowed him whole. Though the ogre was gone, the two-headed dog continued to chase the peasant. Reaching the stable, the peasant fed the magic corn to the enchanted horse. The horse, a magnificent white steed with golden trimmings, neighed in approval and allowed Jack to mount. As the dog lunged, the horse kicked it hard, turning it into a jagged black rock. With the magical horse under his command, the peasant rode back to the palace. The people cheered as he prepared for the final leg of his journey, to climb the witch's mountain and bring Princess home. The peasant had finally escaped from the two men chasing him. He urged his enchanted white horse forward as he made his way up the mountain where the king had told him the witch lived. The horse galloped swiftly, as if it had wings instead of legs, carrying the peasant up the steep mountain in no time. As the horse reached the summit, the peasant looked around, expecting to see a dark cave, but instead he was surprised to find a grove of trees, with something shining through the leaves that appeared to be a house. Curious, the peasant steered his horse closer to the grove, and to his amazement, he saw a beautiful blue castle made entirely of glass, with no doors or windows in sight. Through the transparent walls, he could see a girl spinning inside the castle. She seemed peaceful and unaware of his presence. As the peasant drew closer, the girl's gaze lifted and she saw the shadow of the horse and rider fall on the castle. Her eyes widened in shock. She seemed startled, but before the peasant could jump off his horse and approach the castle, an old woman appeared from the floor of the glass house. With a swift tap of her cane, the girl was transformed into a mouse and scurried away into a corner. The peasant stood frozen for a moment, unable to move, too shocked by the strange turn of events. But then, the witch's laugh echoed through the castle, snapping the peasant back to his senses. He realized, with certainty, that the old woman before him was the witch the king had warned him about. "Ha! Ha!" the witch cried out, her voice mocking. "You may have caught the horse, but you will never bring back the princess unless I say so." She cackled loudly, and in a blink she disappeared through the glass floor, leaving the peasant alone with his thoughts. The peasant, determined to find a way to rescue the princess, walked around the castle, hoping to find an entrance. He searched and searched, but found no doors or windows, no way to get inside. It seemed the castle was sealed tight. He felt hopeless, but then something unexpected happened. The horse, which had been quietly standing by his side, suddenly lifted one of its front hooves and struck the glass castle with great force. With a loud crash, the blue glass shattered, and an opening large enough for the peasant to enter appeared before him. He was about to enter the castle when he heard another crash. He turned to see the horse had followed him in, breaking a larger opening for both of them to enter the castle together. The peasant was amazed, but he wasted no time. He stepped through the opening and into the castle. Inside, the mouse, who had once been the girl, was huddled in a corner, trembling. The peasant gently picked it up and placed it in his pocket, hoping to protect it. The enchanted horse, seemingly knowing what to do, walked over to the spot where the witch had vanished. It tapped the glass floor 3 times with one of its front feet, and with a sudden sound the witch emerged from the floor once again. But this time the witch wasn't laughing. She looked terrified. She trembled so much that she had to lean on her cane to keep from falling. The horse, with a look of determination in its eyes, grabbed the witch by her dress and shook her 3 times. As it did, a small black bean with a white spot fell out of the witch's pocket and dropped to the floor. The moment the bean touched the floor, the witch let out a blood-curdling scream and collapsed on the ground. The horse quickly picked up the bean and swallowed it. As the last of the bean vanished, something magical began to happen. The peasant watched, stunned as the horse started to shrink, and a thick blue mist filled the room, hiding the horse from view. When the mist finally cleared, the peasant couldn't believe his eyes. Where the horse had once stood, now stood a handsome young man, tall and regal, his eyes shining with gratitude. The hole where the witch had disappeared remained, and the peasant, still in disbelief, asked, "Did she fall into that hole?" "No," the young man answered, his voice calm but serious. "That hole leads to the magic charm that will restore the princess to her true form. The witch disappeared into the blue mist." Without hesitation, the young man jumped into the hole and began to climb down a long ladder that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. The peasant, still holding the trembling mouse in his pocket, followed the young man, descending deeper and deeper into the hole until it felt as though they would never reach the bottom. But after what seemed like an eternity, their feet finally landed on something soft and firm. They found themselves standing in a beautiful room, unlike anything the peasant had ever seen. The floor was covered in soft blue velvet, and the walls were draped in sapphire-colored velvet. Golden chairs with velvet seats stood around the room, and in the center of the room was a golden fountain, its waters flowing gracefully into a basin made of sapphire. "This is the magic fountain," the young man said, his voice filled with awe. "If you want to bring back the princess, you must throw the mouse into the water." The peasant hesitated. He looked at the little mouse in his pocket. It was trembling, and he felt a pang of sympathy for it. "It's so frightened," he said softly. "I don't want to throw it into that deep water." Without another word, the young man grabbed the mouse from the peasant's pocket and, with great force, threw it into the fountain. The mouse disappeared into the water, and the peasant gasped in horror. "Oh no, you've killed it!" he cried, staring into the deep blue water, his heart sinking. But then, something incredible happened. Slowly, a head began to rise from the bottom of the fountain. First, it was just a glimpse, but then the figure emerged fully from the water. It was the princess, her golden hair dripping wet but still shining like the sun. A soft breeze flowed through the room, drying her hair and clothes in an instant. The peasant's eyes widened in amazement as the princess stood before them, more beautiful than words could describe. She smiled warmly at the young man who was now standing beside her. "I am the prince who was changed into the horse by the witch's husband," the young man said, his voice steady. "The witch took me, and the ogre who was her husband took the princess. But this brave peasant rescued us. It was he who brought the magic bean that restored me to my true form. If not for a fairy who visited me in my time of need, I never would have known the secret to breaking the spell." The peasant listened intently, watching the princess as she gazed at him with admiration in her eyes. He couldn't help but feel a deep sorrow. He knew that the princess was not for him, and he knew that, despite his good deed, he would never be happy living in a palace. The prince and princess began to look around the castle, taking in their surroundings. The peasant noticed they were in the witch's palace, now empty and abandoned. After a few moments of silence, the peasant spoke. "I will take this palace as my reward," he said. "You should return to her father and tell him of your rescue." The prince and princess agreed, and they made their way to the stables. There, they found beautiful white horses, and the prince and princess mounted one of them. Before they left, the princess turned to the peasant. "Promise us you will come to our wedding and dance with us," she said. "We will never forget you, and we will always be friends." The peasant smiled and promised to attend. As the prince and princess rode off toward her father's kingdom, the peasant felt a sense of peace, knowing he had done the right thing. When they arrived at the princess's home, her parents were overjoyed to see her return. The queen, eager to confirm her identity, asked the princess to show her left shoulder. As the princess bared her shoulder, the queen's eyes widened when she saw a tiny lily-shaped birthmark. It was the mark of their lost daughter. The king arranged a grand feast to celebrate the return of his daughter. The prince and princess were married in a grand ceremony, and the peasant danced at their wedding just as he had promised.